The sun hung low over the prairie on the afternoon of September 15, 1896, casting long shadows across a natural bowl-shaped valley 15 miles north of Waco, Texas. Two locomotives sat motionless at opposite ends of a temporary track. Engines number 9999 and number 1001, one painted bright green with red trim, the other blood red with green accents. Each pulled 6 boxcars chained together and loaded with railroad ties. Between them, on the hillsides rising on 3 sides, 40,000 people waited in the heat. Men in shirt sleeves and women in long dresses clustered around lemonade stands. Children darted between legs. The air smelled of dust and coal smoke and frying meat from the food vendors. A bandstand played patriotic marches. For one day only, this empty stretch of McLennan County prairie had been transformed into the second-largest city in Texas, and every person there had paid $2 or more to watch what they'd been promised for months. A deliberate, meticulously planned train wreck. This was not an accident waiting to happen. This was spectacle as commerce, destruction as entertainment, engineered down to the minute by a passenger agent named William George Crush. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, known universally as the Katy, had authorized him to take 2 obsolete steam engines and crash them head-on at full throttle in front of a paying audience. The company had built a 4-mile spur track specifically for this purpose, drilled 2 water wells, erected telegraph offices, constructed a grandstand and a depot with a platform 2,100 feet long, capable of unloading 10 trains simultaneously. They'd borrowed a circus tent from Ringling Brothers for the concessions. They'd printed thousands of handbills and placed advertisements in newspapers across Texas for weeks. And on this Tuesday afternoon, as the crowd pressed forward against the rope barriers and the police struggled to hold them back the regulation 200 yards from the track, the only question that mattered was whether the boilers would explode. The engineers said no. The Katy's master mechanic, a man named McElvery, had assured everyone that at the anticipated speed, the boilers would not rupture. The locomotives would jackknife upward on impact and crash down again, but the steam chambers would hold. That's what the calculation showed. That's what Crush had told the reporters, who were positioned on a special platform 100 yards from the track, close enough to capture every detail. That's what 40,000 people believed as they waited in the September heat, some perched in mesquite trees for a better view, others standing on the hillsides with opera glasses, all of them drawn by that ancient human fascination with watching things break. The story of how 40,000 people came to stand in a temporary town named Crush begins 3 years earlier and 500 miles to the east in the marble corridors of Wall Street. On May 5th, 1893, the National Cordage Company collapsed. Within days, the stock market crashed. Within weeks, banks across the nation began to fail. The Panic of 1893, as it came to be known, triggered the worst economic depression the United States had yet experienced. By the end of that year, more than 600 banks had closed their doors. 15,000 businesses went under. National unemployment reached 20%. 25% of the railroads in America entered receivership. For the Katy, which had already weathered the financial panic of 1873 and the long deflation that followed, this new crisis hit with particular force. The Katy's corporate existence had begun in 1865 as the Union Pacific Railway Southern Branch, with no relation to the transcontinental line of the same name. In 1870, it was rechristened the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway Company. The name told the strategic story: funnel freight and passengers from the industrialized North through Indian Territory and into Texas, the last frontier state. On Christmas Day, 1872, the first Katy train crossed the Red River at Denison, making it the first railroad to enter Texas from the north. Over the next 2 decades, the Katy expanded aggressively. By the early 1890s, it connected Kansas City and St. Louis to Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, San Antonio, Houston, and Galveston. In 1895, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad reported passenger earnings of $1.2 million and freight earnings of $3 million. It owned 133 locomotives and 163 cars. These numbers, on paper, suggested stability. The reality was more precarious. The Depression of the 1890s strangled the railroad industry. With farm prices collapsing and manufacturing in free fall, freight traffic dropped. Passenger numbers declined as people tightened their spending. Capital for expansion dried up. Between 1893 and 1895, American railroads added only 4,000 miles of new track, a fraction of previous years. Overbuilding during the boom years had left companies overextended. The Katy, like many lines, had accumulated older equipment that was no longer efficient. The 30-ton and 35-ton steam locomotives that had served well in the 1870s and 1880s were being replaced by newer 60-ton engines that could pull heavier loads at greater speeds. By 1896, the Katy had a surplus of obsolete rolling stock sitting idle in its yards. Engines that had no resale value and cost money to scrap. Into this environment of economic stagnation and surplus equipment, William George Crush, the Katy's general passenger agent, brought an idea. He had noticed something about human nature. People were fascinated by train wrecks. Every time a collision occurred, newspapers devoted column inches to describing the twisted metal and shattered wood. Crowds gathered at crash sites. There was a morbid magnetism to destruction, particularly the destruction of machines. And Crush had recently learned that another railroad, the Columbus and Hocking Valley Railroad, had staged a deliberate collision at Buckeye Park near Lancaster, Ohio, on May 30th, 1896. 5,000 people had paid 50 cents each to watch two locomotives smash together. One newspaper had called it the most realistic and expensive spectacle ever produced for the amusement of an American audience. If it could work in Ohio, Crush reasoned, it could work in Texas. And Texas was bigger. Crush presented his proposal to the Katy executives with the confidence of a man who understood both publicity and economics. He would take two of the surplus 35-ton Baldwin steam engines, numbers 999 and 1001, locomotives that were scheduled for retirement anyway. He would paint them in festive colors. He would build a temporary track in an isolated spot away from the main line, somewhere with natural topography that could accommodate a large crowd. He would advertise the event for months, building anticipation, and he would charge special excursion fares, offering discounted round-trip tickets from anywhere in Texas. No admission fee at the site itself, just the train fare to get there and back. The railroad would make money on every ticket sold. The surplus locomotives would be destroyed anyway, so there was no loss of capital, and the publicity would be invaluable. The Katy executives, facing a fourth year of economic depression and desperate for any measure that might boost revenue and public profile, approved the plan. They set the date for September 15th, 1896. The site Crush selected was a stretch of prairie 14 miles north of Waco and 3 miles south of the small town of West in McLennan County. The land formed a natural amphitheater, a shallow valley with hillsides rising on three sides, perfect for viewing. The Katy owned the right-of-way there, and it was far enough from the main Dallas-Houston line that a runaway train could not possibly reach active track. Construction crews went to work in the summer of 1896. They laid 4 miles of temporary spur track with ties and rails. They erected a depot building with a platform capable of handling multiple trains at once. They drilled 2 wells to provide water. They built telegraph offices to handle the communications. They constructed a grandstand for officials and speakers' stands. They set up a platform for the press photographers and reporters. They borrowed a large circus tent from Ringling Brothers to house the food and beverage vendors. They placed a sign over the depot that read, simply, Crush, Texas. For one day, this empty spot on the map would have a name. The locomotives were prepared with equal care. Number 999 was painted bright green with red trim. Number 1001 was painted blood red with green trim, creating a visual contrast that would photograph well and be visible from a distance. Behind each engine, workers chained together 6 boxcars. The boxcars were decorated with banners advertising the Ringling Brothers Circus, the Texas State Fair, and the Oriental Hotel in Dallas. Each boxcar was loaded with railroad ties to add weight and momentum. The chains were deemed more reliable than the standard couplers, which had a tendency to separate under stress. Crush wanted the cars to stay together through the impact, to maximize the visual spectacle of the crash. In late August and early September, the 2 decorated locomotives toured Texas on whistle-stop trips, parking at stations so that people could see them and generate excitement for the coming event. The marketing campaign was relentless. Posters appeared in train stations across Texas, advertising the monster crash in bold letters. Newspapers in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Galveston, and Waco ran daily updates on the preparations. Circulars were distributed throughout the state. Crush himself gave interviews describing what would happen. The 2 engines would be rolled to starting points 1 mile apart. The engineers would throw open the throttles, ride for exactly 4 turns of the driving wheels to build speed, and then leap to safety. The unmanned locomotives would continue accelerating down the slight hills toward the valley floor, reaching maximum velocity just as they met. The anticipated speed was 50 miles per hour for each train. At that combined impact velocity of 100 miles per hour, the collision would produce a spectacular shower of wood and metal. The crowd would be kept at a safe distance. Members of the press would have special access closer to the track, but still at what the engineers calculated to be a safe 100 yards. Everything Crush promised had been planned for maximum spectacle and minimum risk. The public response exceeded all projections. The Katy had expected between 20,000 and 25,000 people. They prepared for that number. But as the excursion trains began arriving on the morning of September 15th, it became clear that the estimates were drastically low. By 10 in the morning, 10,000 people had already gathered at the site. Trains continued to arrive every 5 minutes. The temporary depot's platform, designed to handle 10 trains at once, was overwhelmed. Some trains, packed beyond capacity, had passengers riding on the roofs of cars. The Galveston Daily News reported that men, women, and children, lawyers, doctors, merchants, farmers, artisans, and clerks, representing every class and every grade of society, were scattered around over the hillsides or clustered around the lunch stands, discussing with eager anticipation the exciting event that they had come so far to see. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the scheduled time for the collision, trains were still arriving. The crowd had swelled to an estimated 40,000 people. To put this in perspective, the entire population of Texas in 1896 was approximately 2 million. 1 out of every 50 Texans was standing in this valley. The town of Crush, which had not existed a month earlier, was now the 2nd largest city in the state, larger than Galveston, larger than Austin, exceeded in population only by San Antonio. The vendors ran out of lemonade. The telegraph offices were swamped with reporters filing copy. The police struggled to keep the crowd behind the barriers. People climbed mesquite trees for better sight lines. Others positioned themselves on the slopes with opera glasses and cameras. The mood was festive, anticipatory, crackling with that peculiar energy that comes from a large crowd waiting for something unprecedented to happen. The delay stretched from minutes into an hour. Trains kept arriving. Crush, recognizing that the event could not proceed until everyone was in position, ordered the collision postponed. The bandstand played on. The food vendors did brisk business. Children ran between the legs of adults. Men placed informal bets on exactly where the trains would meet. Women fanned themselves in the heat. Everyone waited. At 5 o'clock, Crush made his entrance. He rode out to the center of the track on a white horse, visible to the entire crowd. He positioned himself where the 2 trains sat facing each other at the midpoint for what would be the final photograph. The press photographers snapped images of the two engines nose to nose, the green and the red, with their decorated boxcars behind them. Then the locomotives were rolled slowly back to their starting points at opposite ends of the 4-mile track, 1 mile from the center in each direction. At 5:10 in the afternoon, with the sun descending toward the horizon and 40,000 people watching, Crush raised his white hat high above his head. He paused for a moment, letting the tension build. Then he whipped the hat sharply down. A great cheer rose from the crowd. On engine 999, the engineer Frank Barnes opened the throttle to a prearranged setting. On engine Wasson, engineer Charles Kane did the same. The firemen E. Stanton and S.W. Dickerson stoked the boilers to maximum pressure. Both crews rode their locomotives for exactly 4 turns of the driving wheels, as rehearsed. Then they leapt from the moving engines and rolled away from the tracks. The trains were unmanned now, 2 35-ton masses of iron and steel and steam, accelerating down the slight incline toward the valley floor. The sound started as a low rumble, faint and far off, but growing with each second. The locomotives gathered speed as they descended the shallow hills. Their whistles shrieked, operated by levers jammed open by the departing crews. Torpedoes that had been placed on the track for dramatic effect exploded in almost continuous succession, adding firecracker pops to the building roar. The crowd pressed forward. Some people turned away, unable to watch. Others stood transfixed. The two trains rushed toward each other, tons of metal and wood and steam and momentum, the green engine and the red engine, each pulling their chain of boxcars loaded with railroad ties. Photographers on the press platform aimed their cameras. Jarvis Deane of Waco, one of the official event photographers, had positioned multiple cameras at strategic intervals to capture different angles of the collision. The Dallas Morning News would later describe what happened next in language that captured the sensory assault. The rumble of the two trains, faint and far off at first, but growing nearer and more distinct with each fleeting second, was like the gathering force of a cyclone. The locomotives closed the final distance in seconds. They struck with a sound that was heard for miles, a thunderous boom followed immediately by the screech of rending metal and splintering wood. The impact threw both engines upward, rearing like mechanical beasts. For an instant they seemed suspended, locked together in a vertical embrace. Then they collapsed sideways, the green and the red folding into each other, the boxcars behind them jackknifing and piling up in a heap of shattered timber. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts. It had been everything they had traveled to see. But then came the silence. For one swift instant, as the dust began to settle over the smoking wreckage, there was a pause in which nothing moved. And then both boilers exploded simultaneously. The twin detonations came so close together that they sounded like a single blast. Superheated steam under hundreds of pounds of pressure per square inch burst from ruptured chambers. The explosions launched debris in all directions. Pieces of iron and steel, varying in size from fragments small as a postage stamp to sections of driving wheel weighing hundreds of pounds, were blown hundreds of feet into the air. Bolts, chains, sections of rail, fragments of the fireboxes, shards of the boilers, all of it became shrapnel. The shower of metal fell across the valley, indiscriminate and lethal. The crowd's cheers turned to screams. People turned and ran in every direction. Others dropped to the ground, covering their heads with their arms. Those who had climbed trees for a better view were trapped in elevated positions as hot metal rained down around them. The press platform, positioned 100 yards from the track as a supposedly safe distance, was pelted with debris. Jarvis Deane, photographing the collision through his camera lens, took a flying bolt directly to his face. The impact punched through his right eye and drove deep into the socket. He collapsed onto the platform, his camera equipment around him, blood streaming down his face. He would later say that his brothers, also present at the event, continued taking photographs for him even as he lay injured. The bolt that struck him would remain partially embedded in his skull. Surgeons would remove some fragments, but not all. Deane would spend several months in a coma before recovering. He would lose his right eye permanently and be known thereafter, with grim affection, as One-Eye Deane. In the crowd 200 yards away, the casualties were immediate. A teenager named Ernest Darnall had climbed a mesquite tree for a clear view. A heavy hook on the end of a wrecking chain, launched by the explosion, arced through the air and struck him between the eyes with enough force to split his skull. He died instantly, his body tumbling from the tree. A section of driving wheel, weighing perhaps 100 pounds, traveled more than 2,000 feet before crashing into the hillside. One witness reported seeing it pass overhead, a massive piece of iron spinning end over end. The daughter of a man named John Overstreet was struck by a jagged piece of steel that fractured her skull. She survived for approximately an hour, but died en route home. Multiple other spectators were hit by smaller fragments. At least 6 people suffered serious injuries from flying debris. Others were scalded by steam or burned when they rushed toward the wreckage to grab souvenirs and touched metal that was still hot from the boilers. When the dust settled and the screaming subsided, the scene was carnage surrounded by thousands of stunned onlookers. The 2 locomotives and 12 boxcars were reduced to a smoking heap of fractured metal and kindling wood, telescoped together with such force that they were almost flattened. Contrary to what engineers had predicted, the engines had not reared up and crashed down intact. They had been pulverized by the combination of kinetic energy and the catastrophic failure of the boilers. All that remained recognizable were pieces small enough to be carried away by hand, which is exactly what the crowd began to do. Despite the deaths and injuries, despite the blood and the screaming, despite the horror of watching people struck by falling metal, the majority of the 40,000 spectators did not flee. They surged forward, they crossed the barriers, they picked through the wreckage, grabbing pieces of wood and fragments of metal as souvenirs. Within hours, everything portable had been carried away. Katy cleanup crews would later arrive to remove only the largest remnants that were too heavy for individuals to move. William George Crush was fired that evening. The decision was immediate and unambiguous. The Katy executives, facing potential lawsuits and public outrage, needed someone to hold accountable. Crush had promised a safe event. 2 people were dead. 6 were seriously injured. Dozens more had minor wounds. A photographer had lost an eye. The company had liability exposure that could dwarf any revenue from ticket sales. The dismissal was telegraphed to newspapers that same night. But within 24 hours, the calculation changed. The story made headlines not just in Texas but around the world. Papers in New York, Chicago, London, and Paris ran accounts of the Crush collision. Every article mentioned the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad by name. The Katy, which had spent months in relative obscurity during the economic depression, was suddenly the most famous railroad in America. Every telegraph office in Texas was swamped with inquiries about train schedules on the Katy line. The publicity was worth more than any advertising campaign could have purchased. Quietly, with no official announcement, William George Crush was rehired the next day. He would continue working for the Katy for 57 more years until his retirement. The railroad moved quickly to contain the legal and financial fallout. Settlements were offered to the families of the deceased and to the injured, along with lifetime passes on the Katy line. Jarvis Deane received $10,000 and a lifetime pass, a sum equivalent to roughly 20 years of wages for a skilled worker in 1896. The families of Ernest Darnall and the Overstreet girl received similar financial compensation. The injured, who had suffered burns or broken bones from debris, received smaller settlements and passes. All of this was done quietly, out of court, with agreements that prevented public trials. The total cost was substantial, but it was absorbed into the company's operating budget. The Katy's executives had concluded that the publicity value outweighed the expense. They were correct. In the months following the collision, passenger revenue on the Katy increased. Freight bookings rose. The railroad that had staged its own train wreck was now the railroad that everyone in Texas wanted to ride. The cultural impact of the crash at Crush rippled outward in unexpected directions. Scott Joplin, the ragtime composer who was performing in the Texas region at the time, wrote a piano piece commemorating the event. The Great Crush Collision March was copyrighted on October 15, 1896, exactly 30 days after the collision. The sheet music was dedicated to the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway. The composition included unusual instructions for pianists to mimic the sounds of the collision through sharp chords, sudden dynamic shifts, and specific playing techniques. It was an early example of programmatic music based on a contemporary event, and it sold well. Joplin's score included sound effects that represented the trains accelerating, the impact, and the explosion. The piece became part of his repertoire and helped establish his reputation before he wrote his more famous rags like Maple Leaf and The Entertainer. The Crush collision had become not just news, but art. The immediate political response was swift. Texas officials, horrified by the deaths and injuries, moved to prevent any repetition. The state passed legislation banning staged train wrecks within its borders. Railroad companies operating in Texas were forbidden from organizing similar events. The law was specific and narrow, targeting only the deliberate collision of locomotives for public entertainment. Regular train operations were unaffected, but the message was clear. What the Katy had done at Crush would not be allowed again in Texas. The ban, however, did not extend to other states. In fact, the publicity from the Crush disaster seems to have inspired imitators. A promoter named Head-On Joe Connolly began staging train collisions across the Midwest and West, charging admission and drawing large crowds. Between 1896 and the 1930s, Connolly organized more than 70 locomotive collisions at county fairs and exhibition grounds. None matched the scale or the casualties of Crush, but the basic formula remained. Obsolete engines, temporary track, paying spectators, deliberate impact. The largest recorded staged collision took place in New York, where 162,000 people attended. Train wrecks as public entertainment became an established, if minor, form of American spectacle. The question that haunted observers then and remains unanswered now is simple. Why did the boilers explode? Master mechanic McElvary and the Katy engineers had calculated the forces involved. They had assured Crush and the public that at 50 miles per hour, the boilers would hold. The chambers were designed to withstand internal pressure, far exceeding what they would experience. Boiler explosions typically occurred due to mechanical failure over time, or operator error that allowed pressure to build beyond design limits, or damage to the boiler shell that created weak points. The locomotives involved, numbers 999 and 1001, were both 35-ton Baldwin engines in service since the 1880s. Older units, but not in such poor condition that catastrophic failure was expected. One engineer, prior to the event, had suggested that the boilers might explode on impact, but he was overruled by the consensus view. That dissenting opinion was noted in some contemporary accounts, but dismissed at the time. The physics of the collision offer some insight, but no definitive answer. Two 35-ton locomotives, each pulling 6 loaded boxcars, traveling at approximately 50 miles per hour, would have generated enormous kinetic energy on impact. The formula for kinetic energy is 1/2 mass times velocity squared, which means the velocity component is particularly significant. When the engine struck, that energy had to dissipate somehow. The metal crumpled, the wood splintered, the momentum converted to heat and deformation, but the boilers were under pressure. Hundreds of pounds per square inch of superheated steam. If the impact created even a small rupture in either boiler shell, the sudden release of pressure would cause the remaining shell to fail catastrophically, producing an explosion. The fact that both boilers exploded simultaneously suggests that the force was sufficient to damage both chambers at the moment of impact, or that the explosion of one boiler created shock waves that triggered the failure of the other. The witnesses described the two explosions as occurring so close together in time that they seemed like one event. Later analysis conducted by railroad engineers and investigators in the years following examined the wreckage and the eyewitness accounts. Some suggested that the engines had been traveling faster than 50 miles per hour at impact, perhaps approaching 60 or even 70 miles per hour. The slight downgrade on both approaches would have allowed gravity to assist acceleration. If the speed was higher than calculated, the impact forces would have been correspondingly greater, increasing the likelihood of boiler rupture. Others pointed to the age of the locomotives and suggested that metal fatigue might have weakened the boiler shells in ways that were not visible during pre-event inspection. Still others noted that the decision to chain the boxcars together rather than use standard couplers meant that the entire mass of both trains, engines, and cars was locked together on impact. This prevented the cars from uncoupling and sliding away, which might have absorbed some energy. Instead, all the momentum was concentrated in the collision zone, where the boilers were located. No definitive mechanical investigation was conducted. This was 1896, before the era of National Transportation Safety Board inquiries or federal oversight of railroad operations. The Katy Railroad conducted an internal review but did not publish detailed findings. The company's priority was settling claims and managing publicity, not conducting forensic engineering analysis. The locomotives and boxcars were hauled away as scrap within days. The temporary track was pulled up. The depot and grandstand were dismantled. Within a week, no physical evidence remained except the disturbed earth of the valley floor. Crush, Texas, ceased to exist as a town. The site returned to empty prairie. The only permanent markers were the memories of the 40,000 witnesses and the deaths of Ernest Darnall and the Overstreet girl. The economic context that gave birth to the crash at Crush deserves examination because it explains why the event happened at all. The Panic of 1893 was triggered by a confluence of factors. Declining Treasury gold reserves, the collapse of major railroads, including the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, the failure of the National Cordage Company, runs on banks, and a credit freeze. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which required the government to buy millions of ounces of silver each month, had created concerns about currency stability. Foreign investors withdrew capital from the United States. Domestic investors converted paper money to gold. The gold standard, which pegged the dollar to a fixed amount of gold, meant that declining gold reserves threatened the entire monetary system. By April 1893, Treasury reserves had fallen below $100 million, a psychologically significant threshold. The stock market crashed. Banks failed by the hundreds. Businesses closed by the thousands. For railroads, the depression was particularly devastating. Railroad construction had driven much of American economic growth during the 1870s and 1880s. Railroads opened new markets, transported agricultural products to cities and ports, enabled the mining industry, and connected the vast geography of the continent. But by the 1890s, overbuilding had created excess capacity. Too many companies competed for too little freight. Price wars cut revenues. Debt loads from construction became unsustainable. When the panic hit in 1893, 1/4 of all railroad mileage in the United States entered receivership, representing close to $1.8 billion in assets, the largest amount recorded between 1876 and 1910. The Katy, which had already navigated the Depression of 1873 through 1879 and the subsequent deflation, now faced another existential threat. In this environment, William Crush's proposal made perfect economic sense to the Katy executives. The railroad needed publicity. It needed people to remember that the Katy existed, that it served major cities across Texas, that its trains were still running. Traditional advertising cost money and reached limited audiences. But a staged train wreck would generate news coverage far beyond what any paid advertisement could achieve. The cost was minimal. 2 obsolete locomotives that would be scrapped anyway, some temporary construction and operating expenses for a one-day event. The potential return was huge. ticket revenue from excursion fares, national and international publicity, and renewed public interest in the railroad. It was a calculated risk, and the executives who approved it were not thinking primarily about safety or spectacle. They were thinking about survival in a depression that had destroyed competitors and was strangling revenue. That calculation, however, did not account for human cost. Ernest Darnall was a teenager. The Overstreet girl was young. Jarvis Deane was a professional photographer with a career and a family. The 6 seriously injured spectators and the dozens with minor wounds were people who had paid money to see something exciting and instead witnessed or experienced trauma. The ethical dimension of the crash at Crush is uncomfortable to examine because it reveals how entertainment and commerce intersect with negligence. Crush and the Katy executives did not intend for anyone to die. They consulted engineers. They established safety perimeters. They believed the assurances that the boilers would not explode. But they also knew they were creating a dangerous situation. They were deliberately destroying 2 steam locomotives in front of a massive crowd. The decision to proceed, even with safety measures, involved accepting a level of risk when the boilers exploded contrary to prediction that risk materialized into fatalities. The moral reckoning was brief and transactional. The Katy paid settlements. Crush was fired and rehired. The spectacle was judged a success. The newspapers, in their coverage, expressed more fascination than outrage. The Dallas Morning News editorialized that when one looked closely at the smoking heap, the vanity of inanimate pride was shown to be as empty and hollow as that of mere mortals, a philosophical observation that avoided direct criticism of the railroad. The paper also noted that the city of Dallas was well represented at the affair by 1,500 Dallasites, a comment that seemed more proud than critical. The Galveston Daily News described the crowd as representing every class and grade of society, framing the event as a democratic gathering rather than a dangerous stunt. The tone of the coverage suggests that in 1896, there was still a cultural acceptance of risk and spectacle that would seem reckless by later standards. People died at public events. It was regrettable, but not necessarily scandalous. The show went on. Jarvis Deane's story offers a coda to the immediate aftermath. After losing his eye and spending months recovering from the bolt that lodged in his skull, Deane returned to his photography business. In an advertisement he placed in a Waco newspaper a few months after the crash, he wrote with dark humor, "Having gotten all the loose screws and other hardware out of my head, am now ready for all photographic business." The $10,000 settlement from the Katy was substantial, equivalent to decades of income, but it could not restore his eye or erase the pain of the injury. He continued working as a photographer for 5 more years before retiring. His photographs of the crash at Crush, including the moment of impact and the explosion, became some of the most widely reproduced images of the event. The irony is sharp. The man who was blinded capturing the spectacle left behind the visual record that preserved it for history. His images appeared in newspapers across the country and have been reprinted in countless histories and articles since. The photograph of the 2 trains in the instant before impact, taken from Deane's platform position, shows the green and red locomotives rushing toward each other with the boxcars behind them, the crowd visible on the hillsides in the background, everything frozen in the last moment before collision. The long-term consequences of the crash at Crush for the Katy Railroad are difficult to isolate from broader economic trends. The depression of the 1890s lifted gradually, starting in 1897. New gold discoveries in Alaska and South Africa increased the global gold supply, easing monetary stringency. Agricultural production improved. Demand for manufactured goods recovered. The Katy, along with most American railroads, returned to profitability. The company continued to expand operations in Texas through the early 20th century. In 1910, it acquired the Texas Central Railway, adding 268 miles of track. In 1900, the Katy owned more than 1,600 miles of operated track in Texas. Passenger trains with names like the Texas Special, the bluebonnet, and the Katy. Flyer became symbols of regional pride. Even during the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Katy remained solvent, reporting passenger earnings of $1.7 million and freight earnings of more than $8 million in 1931. The publicity from the crash at Crush may have contributed to this success by creating name recognition, but it is impossible to quantify. What is certain is that the event did not destroy the railroad. If anything, it enhanced the company's reputation for boldness. The decline came later, driven by forces beyond any single event's control. After World War II, the rise of automobile and truck transportation gradually eroded passenger rail traffic and freight business. Interstate highways built in the 1950s and 1960s offered faster, more flexible shipping routes. Airlines captured long-distance passenger travel. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Katy was struggling. Cost-cutting measures, mergers, and consolidations failed to reverse the trend. In 1967, the railroad reported a net loss of more than $10 million. A government-guaranteed loan of $19 million in 1976 to repair deteriorating track ties provided temporary relief but not recovery. In 1988, the Interstate Commerce Commission approved the sale of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad to Union Pacific and its subsidiary, the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company. On December 1, 1989, the companies merged. The Katy, as an independent entity, ceased to exist. Its legacy survives in historical societies, preserved depot buildings, and converted rail trails. The site of the crash at Crush is marked by a historical marker 15 miles north of Waco. The land is privately owned and looks much as it did in 1896. Empty prairie with gentle hills on three sides. The crash at Crush stands as a peculiar artifact of its time, a moment when economic desperation, technological spectacle, and public entertainment converged in a way that would not be possible or permissible later. The deaths of Ernest Darnall and the Overstreet girl, the blinding of Jarvis Deane, the injuries to dozens of others, all of it was preventable. If the event had not occurred, 2 young people would have lived longer lives. But the event did occur because 40,000 people wanted to see it, because the Katy Railroad needed publicity, because William Crush believed he could control the chaos, and because the engineers were wrong about the boilers. The spectacle succeeded by its own measure. It generated headlines, sold tickets, and made the railroad famous. The cost was human and irreversible. That tension between spectacle and suffering, between commercial success and moral failure, defines the crash at Crush and makes it more than just a historical curiosity. It reveals something about what people are willing to watch, what companies are willing to stage, and what society is willing to tolerate in the name of entertainment. On that September afternoon in 1896, when the dust finally settled and the crowd began to disperse, the sun was setting over the McLennan County prairie. The 2 locomotives were a smoking ruin, unrecognizable as machines. The boxcars were splinters. The temporary town of Crush was already being dismantled, the telegraph wires cut, the depot sign taken down, the grandstand disassembled. By nightfall, only wreckage remained. By the end of the week, even that was gone, hauled away by Katy cleanup crews and scavengers hunting souvenirs. The track was pulled up, the ties removed, the earth left disturbed but empty. The 40,000 spectators went home, some of them carrying pieces of metal or wood, physical tokens of having witnessed something that would never be repeated. In Waco, Jarvis Deane lay in a hospital bed with bandages covering his ruined eye. In a funeral home, the body of Ernest Darnall waited for burial, the teenager's skull split by a flying chain hook. The Overstreet family mourned their daughter, and in a telegraph office, William George Crush composed his report to the Katy executives, knowing that his career hung on their calculation of whether the publicity was worth the price. It was, and it was not. Both things are true, and that is the story of the crash at Crush.